Here, we'll be doing that. We're going to talk about that.
Okay. Friends, shalom.
Shalom.
Don't have here see a marker. Okay. They don't give me markers. Okay. Friends, shalom. So
Are we
I.
next door?
No, it's not so important. Shalom, everyone. Shavua Tov v'Chodesh Tov. We're on the first day of a new Hebrew month, Chodesh Tammuz. I just spoke with one of my cell phones, with Anat Hoffman, that is starting her march together with a few hundred friends and supporters to the Women of the Wall service. And we will get live updates from the wall, so you came to the right place. And not only you get to receive live updates through the SMS from the wall. The topic of our discussion, in a way, is connected also to the issue of the women of the wall and other issues about or in regard to religion and state in Israel, but not only in regard to those issues. Okay? We don't have a lot of time in order to explore this issue of having or not having constitutional law in our Jewish and democratic state. The purpose of our discussion will be mainly to give you the necessary background so you will be able to continue thinking about those issues. Look at our gathering as a lesson in the method of Hillel, the ancient sage that converted a person while he was standing on one leg, telling him, you shall not do to your friend what you don't want others to do to you, and from this point go and continue learning. So in advance I'm saying, friends, probably you will leave the room with more questions than you entered with, but this is the sign of a good Talmudic discussion. Okay. We'll divide our discussion, we'll try to divide it to 4 parts. One will have to do with the general concept of having constitution in a democratic country. Why do we need a constitution? In the second part, we'll talk a little bit about the history of the constitution, the Israeli constitutional law, and we'll see the different developments in order to understand the current situation in which the debate over constitution, the authority of the Israeli Supreme Court, the mere existence of constitutional law without a written constitution, those issues are in a way became to be major political issues in Israel. Not always they reach the headlines, but a lot of the political developments in Israel in recent years have to do with this development of the Israeli constitutional law. Then in the third part, I will share with you something about the challenges we face today when we come to discuss the constitutional foundations of our democracy. And in the fourth part, we'll try to open a discussion. Okay, but feel free if you have questions on the way to raise them. How many of you are lawyers?
Oh.
I'm sure you gave a lot of naches to your mother, but I'm glad I'm also a lawyer, out of business. I'm a progressive rabbi. That's what I do for my living. if you can call it a living. But my main legal profession is constitutional law. My name is Gilad Kariv. I'm today, or in recent years, the executive director, the head of the Israeli Movement for Progressive Judaism, which is actually the Israeli branch of the global reform movement. I was starting to get updates from the Kotel. No, they just want to see that I can get
Is she
SMS.
Yossi's wife? Is she Yossi's wife? Is he Abramovich's wife?
Who?
Anna.
Anat Hoffman?
Yeah, no.
No.
So which one is his? She's the, I'm very good friends with him. And
Okay,
his
but
wife
she's
was
not
arrested
married
last night.
right now,
So
so.
his wife was arrested last night.
Yes?
I don't
Okay,
know
friends.
which one is his.
Okay. I know nothing about the Australian constitutional law. Maybe towards the end you'll share with me few facts. But it's a given fact that today, in most democratic countries, and also in many non-democratic countries, there is a written, legislated constitutions. Even in countries that for centuries carry the narrative of not having a legislated constitution, like the UK, the United Kingdom, in recent years, under the developments of the European constitutional law, also those countries that for years presented the idea of the superiority of the parliament and the lack of need of a written constitution, also those countries like the United Kingdom adopted central elements of the constitutional way of thinking, and today the British Parliament in some areas is subject to the European Constitution or to the constitutional laws of human rights that were adopted by the countries of the EU. Israel is one of the few democratic countries in a modern era that does not have a written constitution. This is one of the few countries in the world today, in the democratic world, that tried to write a constitution several times, but basically failed to do so. Another example of a country that till this minute failed to write a full constitution, although it adopted some constitutional narratives, is Canada. At the same decades in which the Israeli parliament tried to deal with writing a constitution, the Canadian parliament failed to do so also. And I'm mentioning the Canadian example because there are some similarities between the constitutional challenges of Canada and the constitutional challenges of Israel, and we'll address it. Now, although we are not in the law faculty, let's ask ourselves a question. Why do we need a constitution? What is the main purpose of a constitution? First, let's try to define what is the legal status of a constitution. What does a constitution do in a democratic legislative process? What is the role of constitution?
Specifies the limits of the government.
Only the government?
The rights
The
of
government includes courts and other parts of the parliament as well.
Okay, so first of all, a constitution, I don't want to say limits the powers, but set the borders or set the definitions for the authorities of the different branches of government, including, and that's very important, including the parliament and the juridical system. Why it's important to emphasize it? Because the acts of the government, the executive branch, are set and limited by the ordinary law made by the parliament, right? The parliament legislates, and the executive branch, the government, operates according to the law of the parliament. The constitutional law not only deals with the boundaries of the executive branch powers, but also with the boundaries of the power of the parliament and the juridical system. If this is the case, and if this is the main purpose of the Constitution, and we will deal with other important things that the Constitution can do, why it is important that we will have a Constitution? In order to do what? Why do we need to set boundaries to the powers of the executive branch or the parliament if we live in a democracy and the majority rules?
To have individual freedom.
To have individual freedom, to protect what?
The minority against the
Protect the political minority, other minorities. Okay? Democracy is not only about the role of the majority or the power of majority to rule. Democracy is also about, and some claim it is mainly about, limiting the powers of the majority in order to make sure that the rights of the minority, including the political right of the minority to turn itself into a majority through a political procedure, that the majority will not be able to execute its political power in a way that undermines the rights of the minority. Okay? That is why we can understand how come the main constitutional era in the Western world started when? After the? No.
Bill of Rights.
Magna Carta.
Magna Carta.
No, friends, go.
Before that.
Not before. Much later. The friends. We wish. The Second World War. Okay? Although United States of America had a written constitution from the beginning, and although part of the French Revolution was to craft or to design a constitution, most democracies around the world did not have a constitutional piece to their structure of government till the Second World War. And the constitutional revolution in the democratic world began after the war, after the collapse of the Nazi regime. Please keep in mind that half of the world was under British dominance, especially the so-called democratic world, and the Brits stood against the constitutional law because of the superiority of the parliament. By definition, the constitution limits the powers of the current parliament, and the basic idea of the British democracy was that the majority rules. And if the majority elected those delegates to the parliament, you should not limit their rights and authorities. Okay? After the Second World War, there was a growing understanding that sometimes the democratic process itself can be used, or the democratic method can be used in order to promote non-democratic acts. And the lesson that the world learned was the lesson of Germany. We need to remember that the success of the Nazis party to gain control over the country started with the democratic method. They first gained power through the democratic procedure of election, and then following the German Weimar Republic constitution of who gets to appoint the government, and only then they destroyed all democratic mechanisms. And one of the lessons, this is my uncle. He comes to check in the name of my family that I'm not. Yes, I'm doing a good job. That I'm not shaming the family. One of the lessons that were taken from the Nazi regime, the story of Germany, was that it's not enough to have regular democratic methods. Okay, we need to make sure that the majority will not use its political strength in order to promote non-democratic methods and values. Between you and me, we understand that when there is a majority that seriously wants to violate democracy, the fact that there is a written constitution cannot help us, okay? But the concept is that if there is a strong constitution and a strong constitutional mechanism, it will make it harder. Will make it harder to promote views that allow the majority, right, to go against the minority. Okay? And the current situation is that in most democracies around the world, there is a constitutional document and there is a constitutional mechanism. Okay? So we mentioned that the role of constitution is to protect human rights, human liberties, and especially the rights of the minority, because this is the group that need some level of protection because it's not in power, okay? But constitutions have other... You wanted to ask what you mean?
Also definition of the state.
Okay. This is the point. Constitutions have other... Constitutions have other important... excuse me, to those who come, I'm getting updates from the Kotel. Good. This is constitutions have other roles in democratic life. One you just mentioned. Usually constitutions are being used in order to present and even establish the basic narrative of the country. Okay? Constitutions, please. Stay after to complete what you Okay? Usually, or in many cases, constitutions also serve as an educational, cultural tool that set the basic definitions, the basic narratives of the country and the society. Okay? For example, the veteran French Constitution that presented for the first time the values of liberty. The American Constitution, we are the people. Okay? The South African Constitution that actually created a new narrative to a society that moved from the apartheid regime to a multicultural democracy. And that is why many constitutions around the world start with a kind of a cultural, ideological preamble that tells the new or the old story of the state and the society. And not surprisingly, in many Western countries, the constitution is not only a legal document, it's also part of the sacred text and narratives of the society. You talk with an American citizen about the Constitution, it's not only a piece of legislation. Being an American has to do with the relations between the individual and this, how to say, fundamental text. Right? The Constitution is embedded in the American culture. This is the case in South Africa today. Okay? So the second role of constitution is to set the collective narrative. And there is a third very important task for the constitutional document, and that's the task of setting the balances between the different branches of government. In democracies, we usually talk about three branches of democracy, right? The executive branch, the government, the legislative branch, the parliament, sometimes two houses of parliament, sometimes one house of parliament, like in Israel, and the juridical system. Now, because naturally there are tensions between the different branches of government, usually constitution contain also a part that deals with the distribution of powers between the different branches and what are the relations between the different branches. Okay? The mechanism of our democracy. how we protect the idea of separation of branches of government, and how we make sure that this giant orchestra will play together and that each branch will understand what it is meant to do. Many of the constitutional debates today in Western societies, look for example what is happening in the US in recent years, have to do not with the first parts of or the tasks of the Constitution, defining the common ground of the society and the human liberties, but rather with how do we play the game. Just think about the competition between George W. Bush and Al Gore in the elections of 2000 that were all about the ability of the American Supreme Court to intervene in the results of the elections. Okay? Good. Usually, as a result, and this is the concluding remark of our first part, usually, especially in modern constitutions, following these three tasks of the constitutional document, you usually find three parts to the Western democratic constitution. A preamble or an opening statement that will deal with the joint narrative, Bill of Rights that will present the constitutionally protected human liberties and rights, and the institutional part of the Constitution that presents the different branches of government and the relations between those branches. Okay? That's part one. Any questions about general constitutional philosophy? Good. Okay. Now let's move to Israel. Let's move to Israel. I think it's not a secret, and most of you, I'm sure, are aware to the fact that Israel does not have a written constitution. It doesn't mean that in Israel we don't have constitutional law. We have constitutional law, we address it in a minute, but we don't have a written constitution. Already I have been asked, what about the Declaration of Independence? So the Declaration of Independence is only a declaration of independence. And it's not a constitution, because when you examine it, first you see, and we'll see it in a minute, that this document was not aimed from the beginning to be a constitution. B, it has nothing to do with the different tasks that we mentioned in regard to democratic constitutions. And the more important thing is that till 1992, years after the establishment of the State of Israel, this inspirational document had no legal stand in the Israeli law. It was an educational, inspirational, ideological declaration, but the Israeli Declaration of Independence had no legal status in Israel till 1992. And when you read the Declaration of Independence, and usually people skip this part of the Declaration of Independence, you discover a very interesting thing. That although Israel inherited the British concept of law, till maybe even today we lean more towards the continent, the continental, not the continental, the British law, than the continental law that has a lot to do with written documents. Although we inherited the British legal heritage, Israel took upon itself from day one the task of writing a constitution. And basically, as long as we don't have a written constitution, Israel is not fulfilling the desire of the founding parents of the country that publicly declared we are going to write a constitution. And you can see in one of the paragraphs, we hereby declare that with effect from the moment of the termination of the mandate being tonight, the eve of Shabbat, the 6th of Iyar, and until the setting up of a duly elected bodies of the state in accordance with the constitution to be drawn up by the elected constituted assembly not later than 1st day of October 1948. We're a little bit late, you know, but we are not with time. The People's Council shall act as a provincial council of the state. Okay? The founding parents of our, you see that I'm a progressive rabbi, I'm using gender-sensitive language, not founding fathers, founding parents, women of the world. The founding parents of our country took upon themselves to legislate a constitution basically in 6 months. How come they took upon themselves this irrational task? Because this demand can be found where? In the UN resolution from November 29, 1947. Under this constitutional mood of the international community, in the decision over the establishment of a Jewish state and an Arab state in Palestine / the land of Israel, one of the demands was that the two states will be based on a democratic constitutional concept. And part of the terms of independence were to constitute a constitution, and the leaders of Israel that found it very important to follow this international mood in order to protect the legitimacy of establishing the state, made it very clear that we are serious about implementing all parts of the UN decision. In a different section of the declaration, you can see that they also declared that they are serious about implementing the part they're talking about Jerusalem as an international sovereignty. Unfortunately, they weren't serious enough about this part. Fortunately or unfortunately, that depends on your political view. I think fortunately, they weren't serious also about handing Jerusalem to an international mandate. Okay? So Israel took upon itself to have a written constitution in order to meet the demands of the international community. What was the excuse that we used not to meet this date and not to have a constitution in October 48? What took place in October 48? The war. Okay? The independence war, the 48 war. And Israel, of course, for good reasons, said to the international community, you are not serious, you don't think we can legislate a constitution while we are battling for the mere existence of the country. But even when the war ended, it was quite clear that the Israeli government and parliament are not going to implement this international demand and not to have a constitution. How come I'm saying it in such a direct way? Because in February 1949, as a result of the first democratic elections in the State of Israel, the Constitutional Assembly was gathered. The Israeli citizens, the new Israeli citizens, went for the first time in their sovereign life as citizens of an independent state. They went to the polls not in order to elect a parliament, but rather to elect a constitutional assembly. And that was the name of this body, האספה המכוננת, not הכנסת, אלא האספה המכוננת, the Constitutional Assembly. And the only task of this assembly was to write down a constitution. This Constitutional Assembly was first assembled on Tu B'Shvat, Tafshin-Tet, 1949. It was February 14th, 1949. In February 16th, 1949, 2 days later, a bill was passed. It is called Chok HaMa'avar, the transition bill. And in this bill, the Constitutional Assembly announced, we are the parliament. And we are not anymore the Constitutional Assembly. We are the first Israeli Knesset and we act like a parliament. So 2 days after the Constitutional Assembly was opened, as a result of democratic elections to the constitutional body said, you know what, it's too big for us. We want to be an ordinary parliament. And they became to be the first Knesset of the state of Israel. Yes?
Was there no challenge to that? Because that was beyond what they were elected for.
Yes, there was a very big challenge and there was a very big dispute. But because this was the will of the governing party, Ben-Gurion party, and their partners, there was a huge majority to leave aside the constitutional duty and to move into a British-style parliamentary democratic era that in a way continued till 1992. Okay? So Israel neglected in a very directed, open-eyed way the international duty and the commitment of the founding fathers and mothers to have a written constitution. Today, in the public discourse in Israel, usually who is to blame for not having a written constitution?
The Haredi.
The Haredim. Okay, usually when you ask an ordinary Israeli in the street, how come we don't have a written constitution? Immediately we point at the Haredi parties. And we say, they didn't want a legislated constitution because a legislated constitution talks about equality, talks about freedoms, and the Haredi parties found it very important to create an Orthodox monopoly. The truth is that although the ultra-Orthodox parties really didn't want a constitution, the main opposition to the constitutional idea came from Ben-Gurion's government. I'm an admirer of Ben-Gurion, so don't think that I'm criticizing him too much. I was born on the day of his death. I almost was named David, but I had my second grandfather was from the Irgunim. He came from the Lehi, so he said, no way, my grandchild will be named after Ben-Gurion, so I was saved from the name David, and I'm only Gilad. But Ben-Gurion didn't want a constitution. Why Ben-Gurion didn't want a constitution?
It would rein him
Hmm?
in. It would rein him in.
It will?
Would rein him in.
It will limit the authorities of the government. And Ben-Gurion thought, and maybe justly so, that when you build a state in such a complicated reality, the government and the parliament, with their majority, okay, and remember in Israel, the government depends on the parliament majority. It's not like in the US. If you are the prime minister, you should have a majority in the parliament. Ben-Gurion thought that when you build a state in such rough conditions, the last thing you need is to limit the authorities of the government to do big things. Now, please keep in mind the fact that in Israel we had 700,000 citizens in 48, 600,000 Jews, 100,000 non-Jews after the war, after many Palestinians fled from the areas that in the end was in the premises of the Jewish state in 48. Those 700,000 citizens tripled themselves till the end of the 50s. Right? Israel welcomed 1.5 million new immigrants towards till the end of the 50s. Okay? When a government needs to deal with housing, with building a public education system, with a public health system, you don't want constitutional courts to intervene what you are doing with issues of property, for example. So Ben-Gurion's attitude can be understood. I'm not saying it can be justified. Please keep in mind a piece of reality, sad reality, that we, Jews in Israel and overseas, we usually forget. Friends, till 1965, there was a military regime inside sovereign Israel over the non-Jewish Arabic citizens. Okay? Again, before 67, before we had the territories, inside sovereign Israel, the only democracy in the Middle East, till 65 there was a military regime over the Arab community. They voted to the Knesset, but in order to leave the country, they had to receive a permission from the military governor of their village. It was only Levi Eshkol in 65, the third prime minister of Israel, that led the cancellation or demolished the military regime over the Arab community. In a constitutional era, basically, if it's a democratic constitution under this vision of post-war human rights, how can you justify military regime? If you have a strong constitutional code, immediately you will come to the government and will tell them, are you a military regime over hundreds of thousands of citizens? So Ben-Gurion didn't want a constitution.
Isn't there still military law in the West Bank?
Look, definitely. Definitely, friends, I'm not entering the issue of occupation, liberation of the territories, but you need to know the fact. There is nothing between the Israeli sovereign democratic law and what is happening in the territories. The territories are under military regime. Okay, and the Israeli law cannot be applied over the green light, and here there is no debate between the left and the right. The left also doesn't want the Israeli law to be implemented across the green light, because this means that there is no occupation. We embrace the territories into the sovereign parts of the state of Israel. Okay? Now, Ben-Gurion had a problem. First, he had a problem with his international commitment. Second, he had a problem with some political factors that say, well, mister, you cannot do it. We cannot be a democratic state with no constitution. So in 1950, a committee was established, headed by an Israeli Knesset member, a very distinguished law scholar, Harari, and he came with a solution, a good Jewish Israeli solution to the problem. Let's do it step by step. We have no reason to hurry, to rush with our constitutional operation. And instead of writing a constitution, let's start to legislate basic laws. In the end, after we legislate all the basic laws, all we need is to collect them into a written constitution. Right? We'll deal with the basic law that deals with elections, a basic law that deals with the government, the basic law that deals with the Knesset, the basic law that deals with the Israeli army, with the lands management in Israel. No. The only problem was that the Knesset didn't give any special constitutional status to those laws. They were titled basic laws, but they were not more important or efficient from a regular law of the Knesset. You could have replaced them with a simple majority. Not even 61 out of the 120 Knesset members. 3 against 2 could have changed the basic laws. And the basic laws were not seen as real constitutional legislation, meaning that the Israeli Supreme Court could have not used the basic laws in order to overrule the ongoing regular legislation of the Knesset. So it was a very nice narrative. We legislated a lot of important basic laws, but they were actually ordinary laws that deal with important issues. Okay? This was the case till 1992. And in 1992 started what we call today in Israel, and this is a huge political public debate in Israel. In 1992 starts what we call the constitution, the quiet constitutional revolution in Israel. What happened in 1992? By a very small majority, 26 for, 19 against. Okay? Small part of the Knesset members attended the hearing and the voting. 2 laws, 2 basic laws were passed. One is human dignity and liberty, and the second is not here, is freedom of occupation. And for the first time in Israeli legislated history, three things happened. First, the Declaration of Independence of the State of Israel was granted legal status because the first section of the laws said that basic human rights in Israel are based on the recognition of the value of human being and the sanctity of his life and his freedom, and this will be respected in the spirit of the principles of the Declaration of Independence of the State of Israel. Suddenly the declaration has some legal status. The second thing was that for the first time we had the Bill of Rights. I didn't bring it here, but all the other sections of the law deal with basic human rights. Okay, and you can see section 1a, the purpose of this basic law is to protect human dignity and liberty in order to anchor in a basic law values, the values law of the State of Israel as a Jewish and democratic state. This is the first time in the Israeli law that the term Jewish and democratic state appears. It's not an old expression, it's a new, from 1992. Okay? And it was a result of a compromise between those that wanted just a Bill of Rights and those who said, well, look.
This part that complies with that and saying that's the law now.
Right. The foundation of the Israeli Quiet Constitutional Revolution is a very, very weak foundation because the parliament, which should be under the superiority of this basic law, is the same parliament that can replace this law in any given moment. Right? Okay? The Section 8, which is not unique, you can find it in many other constitutions, gave the Israeli Supreme Court the ability to claim that a constitutional revolution happened in Israel. Why? Because the Supreme Court, in a very known and long ruling, said, well, if no one can violate the protected rights, it's the duty of the court to say when this law is being breached, not only by the ordinary person in the street, but also by the government, but not only the government, also by the parliament. Okay? The Israeli Supreme Court said, I don't see in this section an exception that the parliament itself, the Knesset, is not subject to this provision, to this section. It means that the parliament itself is not allowed to legislate a law that violates those rights. Who is in charge to say if a law was breached or no? The court. And the Israeli court, the same way the American court did it 200 years before, because there is no constitutional overruling concept in the American Constitution. The American Supreme Court took this authority to himself. The Israeli Supreme Court in 1992, actually it was in 1995, the first ruling said for the first time, friends, there is a superior force. Everything is okay. The women of the wall are praying next to the wall. Breaking news. Friends, that's 7:10 in Israel, way to 7:30. Don't celebrate yet. We want them back. But, okay, for the first time in the Israeli history, the Supreme Court told the parliament, the government, and the Israeli people, the parliament is not the most superior force in our democracy. When it comes to the violation of human rights, okay, the basic law is the superior force, and we, the Supreme Court, we are responsible to analyze it, to interpret it, to impose it, not only on the government, on the military, on the municipalities, but also on the parliament, meaning we are allowed to overrule parliament legislation. This is the quiet or not so quiet constitutional revolution that we are dealing with in the last 20 years. Okay? And when people are talking about the Israeli constitutional era, constitutional revolution, juridical activism, they mean this. That the court, with no clear and direct order by a constitutional assembly, said, I understand this piece of basic law as giving me the authority to overrule the legislation of the Knesset. And you are right about a problem in the mechanism, that the same parliament can basically change the basic law. But the Supreme Court says, you don't change the law, I have this constitutional mandate. Until now, the fact is that although there is a serious criticism vis-à-vis the court, they didn't change. The parliament didn't change the basic law. Yeah.
So what's to stop conservative appointments to the bench by, like in the US?
Great. Once this became to be our constitutional situation, and the Israeli court, although it was very careful about it, and only few times it used this authority, the Israeli court started to cancel parliament legislation. Again, it is being done very carefully, but I will give you a dramatic example. I'm sure that many of you, if not all of you, are aware to the big controversy over the military draft of the Haredi community.
Yeah.
Right? This is a very old controversy, but how come it became now to be such a burning topic? Because the Israeli Supreme Court, in the last ruling of the former president of the Supreme Court, Chief Justice Dorit Beinish, in her last day on the bench, she, together with other chief justices, cancelled the Knesset legislation that granted the Haredi youngsters the permission not to go to the army. The Supreme Court said we cannot protect this legislation from a constitutional point of view on the basis of the basic law of human dignity. Please, you, the parliament members, you need to legislate a new law. The former Netanyahu government, and I mentioned this today, the former Netanyahu government went to the polls because of this issue. Kadima joined the coalition in order to deal with this issue. They left after 40 days because they thought Netanyahu is not serious about it, and then Netanyahu called elections. The biggest debates in the current government, or the biggest constitutional act of the current government, is to come up with a new law for the military draft. It all restarted by the court implementing its constitutional authority. Now, in Israel, we have a very unique system of appointing judges. In Israel, the process of appointing judges is influenced by political forces, but it is not dominated by political forces. There is a committee of 9 members. Only 4 out of the 9 are politicians. 2 ministers and 2 Knesset members. The other 5 come from the legal world. 3 Supreme Court judges that sit on the committee, and 2 members of the Israeli bar. 5 legal professionals, 4 politicians. This committee gets to appoint all the judges in Israel, from the local courts to the Supreme Court. Okay? It's the other way around from the American system. In the American system, all courts have the authority to overrule Congress legislation. Even the lowest court in Missouri can decide that the law of the American Congress violates the Constitution. But in exchange, who gets to appoint the judges? The politicians. Okay?